Attention! During this podcast, you may experience eureka moments or feel slightly empowered, inspired, energized, and ready to start up at a moment's notice with today's host, Cullen Pope, on Silicon Beach Radio.
Welcome to the Melbourne Silicon Beach podcast. Hi, thanks for joining me here at Silicon Beach Radio. I'm very fortunate today to be able to bring with me Warrick Cramer, who has joined us here in Melbourne. And I believe, Warrick, you've just returned from Silicon Valley, is that right?
That's correct, Cullen. Yes, thank you. Really happy to be here. I just returned back to Melbourne last week.
Okay, great. But in actual fact, you've been based in Europe. You were in Luxembourg as the CEO of Tomorrow Street, which is Vodafone's. Now, tell me if I get this wrong. Vodafone's Global Innovation Accelerator. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Yeah, it's Vodafone's Global Innovation Centre, and we really focus on the late stage startups. So absolutely, a lot more. We're looking for the more mature companies.
Okay, brilliant. And so how long have you been there?
I've been at Vodafone for 4.5 years now.
Okay, fantastic. And I think is the motto really for that whole accelerator, that sort of connection was really about taking startups on a journey to reach the world. Is that really the center of what the ethos was behind that?
Yeah, I mean, the ethos, Cullen, for Tomorrow Street was really giving sort of startups opportunity to think about how they're going to go global. Because a lot of the startups, when they're dealing with a very big organization such as Vodafone, is where do they actually start and who do they actually contact? Simple as that. And to be really honest, even though I'm CEO, I actually find it difficult myself at occasions to find the right person within the organization. So I can only imagine how difficult it would be for startups. So really the ethos for Tomorrow Street was really thinking about how can we make this whole process simple for startups? How can we really make it easy for them to get to the right person, deal with the right person, and how do we then create a platform or an area where we can sit there, roll up our sleeves and work with them in terms of how do they go to the market and really work on a strategy in terms of go-to-market strategy and what is the addressable market for their particular product or service.
Okay, brilliant. And I know that you're back in Melbourne now looking around the ecosystem.
Yes, yeah? Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I've you probably can tell by my accent, I'm definitely not from Europe. I was born in back home, and I've really seen over the last 4.5 years, having left Melbourne. It's probably been a little bit longer than that actually, but I'm sort of being away for over 5-6 years now. Coming back into the country, just seeing how many sort of co-working spaces have popped up. When I left, there was actually nothing. So I was really surprised at just how quickly that has progressed. But also just the level of startups that are around. I've been very fortunate to sort of be going around the scene in Melbourne and Sydney and just talking to various different startups and just seeing what technology they're doing and some of the things that they're talking about. And it's really lovely to see, and I was really pleasantly surprised.
Brilliant. Now, we've been talking sort of on and off over various times of rolling this idea together. We're going to try tonight, which is around imagining this kind of super express life of a startup. And it's a bit of a challenge, but I've set it up so I think we can do it. And I'll just explain it to everybody what our idea was. It was just we wanted to unpack really quickly, I guess 3 or 4 stages within the life of a startup. And I wanted to get your input into each one of those areas in a really succinct way, if we can, because it's been part of the conversation. So I've created this startup for you, okay?
Okay.
And it's called Apt. Hopefully it's fun. It's called Apt Possible. Okay. And it's an app. It's an app for invoices. And what it does is it's on your phone, and instead of having to when you get the invoice from the FPOS machine, you've got to photograph it and then you send it to your Xero account and it's sucked up magically there, and then your bookkeeper and what have you go and look after it. So what this app does is you just point it towards the machine as it's printing the receipt. You don't even need the receipt, and it just sucks the information up, right? This is our startup called Apt Possible.
Nice.
Okay.
Like it.
All right. Brilliant. So we're going to go through these 4 stages. And let's say they're about to pitch, and imagine they've got everything right. The pitch is right. They've solved the problem. They've got the audience, and they're in Melbourne, Sydney. They're in front of a group of judges, and they're just about to pitch. What's one piece of information you're going to give them before they walk on stage they might not have thought of?
I get to hear a lot of pitches around the world as part of my role, and because I manage 29 countries for Vodafone, and as part of that, I get as I said, a lot of different organisations in all different levels. And one of the things that seems to come up quite consistently, irrespective of what country I'm in, is a lot of startups that I meet are not clear in terms of what problem they're trying to solve. So a lot of founders that I meet and CEOs is they get so caught up in the detail around, the technology around behind, in this particular case, the invoicing, app, rather than thinking about what problem am I trying to solve for, the consumer, and what is going to be the benefit, and then what is the commercial model around it. And how are you going to make money, and where are you going to address, and which market are you going to address, and how are you going to address it. And something as just simple as that, I find that a lot of the time people trip up on it consistently.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you said that, the words that spring to mind were critical mass. The kind of math behind understanding exactly how many users or how many consumers or how many customers you need in order to have a critical mass around your products, for example. Would that be one area do you think that might not have always been thought out, or not quite?
Yeah, I think it's around segmenting, really, because I think if you look at, for example, different commercial models, you might have a SaaS platform which is pay per license. But then if you're going to be pitching it to this particular product, and you're going to be going to an enterprise, well, I can tell you right now, even from a Vodafone perspective, I'll put my hat on there, we are not going to pay per user. We're going to look for a global licensing model. And so it's really about thinking as a founder, who are you actually pitching to? And, how are you going to actually connect with that person or that enterprise? So, a lot of the time I get founders that get up there and they've only got the SaaS model and per user. And when you've got 150,000, 120,000 employees, it gets very expensive. And so, and it's not doable. So automatically when you do the maths at the other end, and I'm sitting there and calculating in my head, I'm thinking to myself, well, we're not going to pay 200 or 300 million or whatever it might be for this. And then thinking about incremental growth. So a lot of the time, a lot of founders, and when they're going out their pitch, they're looking for that sort of holy grail. Like, let's go in there. I'm going to pitch. I've got the best product or service and everyone's going to love it. I want to walk out of there and I'm going to do a 20, 30, 50 million dollar deal or whatever it might be. It's really about thinking about I have to manage risk. That's my job, right? And so from a corporate perspective, I put, no matter what work, or whether it be Vodafone or else, put the corporate at risk in terms of saying, okay, we're going to go and throw 20 million or 30 million at a particular product or service. I'm going to do it in small chunks because I need to know that the founders that I'm going to be investing in and the team I'm going to be investing in is that they're going to be fully 100% committed. And as you sort of start going, you see a lot of problems emerge, and it's how they actually deal with those sort of challenges that come up, because you're always going to have it in business, irrespective of how big or small. So there's a lot of different criteria, and I'm sorry I've sort of digressed a little bit here and I've gone off the path, but I think when they're pitching, there's so many different planes and so many different areas that we look at rather than just one particular subset. Because when people pitch to me, I'm looking at the founders, Cullen, and I'm trying to understand how well are they connected? Are they on the same page? And some sometimes I'll hear and I'll go to a founder and I'll look. There's always someone that's talking, right? And there's always another one or two people in that group that are dead silent. And I'll turn to those silent people and I'll turn around and say to them, well, what's your exit strategy? When are you actually going to be leaving? And at what point are you going to leave? And it's really funny when something as simple as question as that. A lot of the time, if they're not joined up together as a group, they'll stumble with that question, and they'll become very uncomfortable with that question. And then in turn, that makes me feel very uncomfortable, because it means that they haven't really been very open as a group and then as a management team in terms of what their overall strategy is as a business. And then what are those key milestones? Are they going to have those sort of discussions as to, okay, when we hit this particular point, whether it be Series B, Series C, or what have you funding, that's going to change the nature of our relationship. We're going to get more people in here. And you know what? We might actually need to get someone external to run the company for us. We might need a seasoned CEO to come in here. And these are the sort of mature discussions that companies that I see that really grow and hit 100 to 300 million plus revenue, they're the ones that actually are quite mature in this sort of a level of conversation and dialogue.
And I guess there's a lot of reasons why, I suppose, people don't want to think about an exit strategy. I guess there's some I guess there's some romance. There's a whole lot of things, isn't there? There's a whole emotional connection, there's a whole human connection, difficult to untangle all of that. But then I suppose there's genuinely people that just hadn't even thought of that. If people are beginning to think about putting an exit strategy in place, what are the couple of the core things to think about that you haven't mentioned that help you along the way?
I think the exit strategy is probably the most important thing that I can always help founders with when I sort of mentor different sort of groups. I say to them, it's not about exiting, it's about the discipline of thinking about, if you are going to exit the business one day, what is that person or that investor or whoever's going to come in and take out your company or buy it, what are they going to be looking for? And really, when you take it and when you start to unpack that, you really start to think about, well, what systems and processes do I need to have in place? What sort of management team do I need to have in place? What's the governance structure I need to have in place? What's my marketing strategy? What's my sales strategy? And you sort of start to unpack all these different work streams within your business. And it really starts to get you to think very differently. It's not about you leaving tomorrow. It's about you thinking about, how can I get my business ready? So in the future, when that time comes, it's going to be an attractive business for people or investors to come in and buy, or and for me to exit the organization. So I think, and I think for a lot of founders, they struggle with that whole exit strategy, because when you sort of start talking about it, they think, oh, no, I've just started, Warrick, why do I want to leave? And they go, it's not about you wanting to leave. It's about you thinking differently and thinking about a corporate as an organization and building this to something that's going to be fairly professional. You hit on a point there, Cullen, around romanticism. And a lot of startups that I do meet, it is quite, it's a romantic idea, and it's pretty cool, when you're going out and someone asks you, what do you do? And I've got my own startup and, and all this sort of stuff. So it is a pretty trendy thing, but the reality is it's actually quite hard. And there's a lot of sacrifice that actually goes with it. And, and there's a lot of resilience in the sense where, you're going to have more rejections, consistently, and you're going to have more people telling you that it's not possible for you to make a success of whatever you're trying to get off the ground here. And I think you can look at this in two ways. You can look at it and say, okay, well, they don't know what they're talking about, and I'm just not going to listen. I'm going to do it anyway. Or you can sort of take it on board, and you can try to sort of understand, well, what are they seeing that I don't see? And that's very difficult. That can be very difficult for a lot of people. And I've Cullen, when people have pitched to me, and sometimes I've had to be a little bit direct. And the way I look at it is, I rather be very honest with people rather than them going down the track and wasting 1 or 2 years. I rather try to get them onto the right bit of course correction earlier on, because I
Yeah.
think
That just made me think. One of the things we talk about at Silicon Beach a lot is empowering founders. And I suppose the other thing is I wanted to ask you was, I think also like our experiences is be interested to see what you feel is founders. They're quite often on a journey. They're on startup 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, and so in actual fact, the journey of the founder to the successful startup, it might not be the 3rd, it might not be the 5th, it could be the 9th or even more. Do you see that more, that people are able to perhaps build and move on quicker in some circles, and then of course in other circles of course not? Do you see that there is a velocity change there in terms of how quickly people can move on to their next idea if they get a bit of traction and the first one doesn't quite work?
Absolutely. I think it really comes down to the people you're around. But, it's funny because if I look at regions around the world, Cullen, like, so for you going, when I'm in the US, whenever I'm in Silicon Valley, I'll talk to all different sort of founders and all different sort of levels. And, you're absolutely right. They might have tried 3, 4, 5 times and, they're quite proud of the battle scars, because it's all part of it. It's all part of the learning process. It's not about the failure. They never look at it as something negative. They look at it as something as a learning, saying, well, you know what, it didn't work out here. However, I've learned X, Y, Z. And so therefore, when I apply it to my next startup, I'm not going to make those same mistakes. And I think that's a really, really positive way. And I think that's the right way to look at things. Whereas if I look at Europe, where I spent, a lot of my time living and working in Europe, it's much more conservative societies. So it's actually it's quite shameful. So if you're a startup and you fail, you almost have to hide, and people don't talk about the failures. And so one of the challenges that I had even within my own teams within Europe was really getting them to talk about failures on just a day-to-day basis, sort of saying, Warrick, coming clean that this didn't work. And I would say, well, that's okay. What did you learn from it? Whereas in the US, with my US team and Canadian team, I didn't have that problem. I found Australia's probably somewhere in the middle, if that's, that's my sort of my observation, whether right or wrong. I think it's still, if you've got a startup and it's failed, it's still not deemed to sort of, you can't sort of show those battle scars as much in Australia, and that's sort of just a feeling I get talking to different sort of startups. And as I said, I could be totally wrong, Cullen. So you might have a better perspective on this than I have, because I've been out of Australia for many, many years, and when I come back in, I just sort of pick this up from talking to people. But I think you should be proud of it. I think you should not be afraid to tell people that, yes, I've had a startup and it didn't work out, and this is reasons why it didn't work out. And from an investor point of view, as an investor, you gain a little bit more confidence knowing that people have had those sort of failures. And because, it does, even though it's hard at the time to go through that, I think when you come out of it at the other end, I think you're a lot stronger and a lot more wiser, and therefore and that maturity kicks in as well. So from an investment point of view, there's a bit of a safety net for us from an investor.
Yeah, that's right. And I think for many, many people, that's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? So I'm very fortunate in some ways to spend time with people who, I guess it's like a marriage between the investor and the founder. And so there's a very open, clear relationship where, before people even invest, they say, yeah, well, look, I'm on my 4th adventure, and this is where it all went wrong before. But, and so they have to have these very, very honest conversations in order to actually move ahead and get some traction with the investor and get some trust, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's very important. And I think, building that trust, that confidence, and sort of saying, yes, okay, yes, I have the battle scars. I haven't done it right, but that's okay. And I think it just shows a level of maturity for sure.
Yeah, brilliant. I know that You've spent quite a bit of time with startups that have successfully managed to get through to their first 1, 2, and 3 rounds of funding. I just wanted to ask you, approaching that first round of funding is a very nerve-wracking event, obviously, for a lot of people. What do you think has changed in that space over the last couple of years in terms of what do you think are the new things you need to think of about, when you're just going for that first round of funding?
I think you really need to think about where you're going to get the money from.
Yeah.
So I think, a lot of the startups that I'd sort of meet, years ago, you were happy just to get money to get going. But I think now as the investors are sort of in the VC community's grown, the government sort of programs across the world have grown. So therefore, startups are actually in a very good position because now they can go to a government, for example, I'm still trying to learn, the sort of funding rounds and the support here in Australia. But I know within Europe, and even the US and UK, et cetera, they've got great incentives for startups, and they a lot of seed capital, and a lot of support for them around that sort of environment to help them to sort of go through those different stages. So I think really the first and foremost is making sure that you don't give up too much too quickly, too soon, and making sure that you're getting the money off the right people that are going to help you to get to the next stage. And that's probably very, very important. As you sort of go down latter stages, then you sort of, once you get to your sort of Series A, Series B sort of funding, that's more institutional investment. And that's sort of when you start seeing some really big numbers coming through. But I think initially in that early stages, you really need to surround yourself with people where you can actually learn from, where it's not always about how much money they're going to give you, but it's more around their knowledge base and their network of how they can connect you, which is far more valuable than what money sometimes. Because look, at the end of the day, if you get $1 million but you've got no network, then it's useless. Whereas you might get 500K, but they might connect you to a real customer, and that will be more valuable because then you get that validation. So I think it's really just thinking about, what's going to work for you. But also being a little bit more savvy around where you're actually getting that money from.
Yeah. Okay. Just jumping back to our little startup, our Apt Possible, right?
Yeah.
Imagining they've got their first round of funding, they're heading into rounds 2 and 3, taking all of those things into consideration, obviously to do with networking, and that. The third round of funding is different to the second round of funding in many ways and some fundamental things. But I guess the advice that you might give somebody in round 3 is different to the advice you'd give them in round 1. What would you say in that sort of round 3 scenario where you're really heading over the hill?
So just so I'm clear, so round 3, we would say what, Series A, Series B funding?
Yeah, Series B funding.
So Series B funding, I think when you get to Series B funding, Helen, I think you really need to look at institutional investors, and you need to think of investors that are actually going to be at a global level for you. If you're thinking local investors, I think you're going to probably struggle unless they've got a really global pool. For me, when you get into Series B, definitely looking at investors, bigger ones, typically in the Valley or in Europe, or even in Asia, but can take you into other markets and help you through that process. Because if they don't have the right connections across the world, then your startup's going to probably struggle and you're going to probably hit the wall with that. So I think that's very, very important at that sort of Series B funding round.
That reminded me of something you said in another interview recently, and you might remember where that interview was. I remember seeing it, but I can't remember where it was. But it was where you were talking in some detail about how when people start off, it's really good to have an open mind about being global, as opposed to sort of setting up some structures where you think this is my local market, this is my village, or this is my country. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that? I'm sure you can remember talking about it.
Yeah, look, I think I talk about that a little bit, quite a bit actually, because one of the key fundamental things that I look for and my team looks for is that we look at companies that we can scale. And if they're not scalable, then we don't bother. to be really honest with you. We keep them at a local level and our local market within one of our Vodafone operating companies, so wherever that might be. I think, the companies that think sort of global, and, I feel sometimes really sorry for some startups, Cullen, because I meet them sometimes, and a lot of the time they'll pitch and they haven't done a basic thing of actually just doing market research on their product or service. And many times I've had to say to them, look, I'm really sorry, but this already exists and it's already quite mature.
Yeah.
And so what are you actually offering that's going to be different to this? And sometimes they're just not even aware of the competition. I think when they think at a local level too, they're limiting their ability to be able to scale the business in the future. And I think Australia, I think having lived outside Australia and now coming, looking back into Australia now, I see a fundamental sort of, I suppose things, we always sort of see ourselves as far away from everywhere else in the world. And therefore it's just an automatic barrier because it's too difficult, right? It's really, really hard. Unlike in Europe where I can just jump in the car and I can go across 3 countries in 2 hours. You don't have that luxury here in Australia. But I think nowadays with the technology, you can sort of build global networks without even having to leave Australia.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And using that technology to do that, I think is very important. But I think, the companies typically like that I've met here in Australia that are only looking at locally, I have to honestly admit, we don't spend a lot of time with them because we just know it's going to be very limited and they haven't really thought about, the product life cycles, the roadmaps, the different segments and how they're going to grow that company because at the end of the day, Australia is a relatively small market.
It's funny you said that because somebody pitched recently and the name of their company was similar to another large company, which I would have imagined most people know it. So at some stage, somebody had to quietly tap this person on the shoulder and say, look, I think that company name's already been used. And I was like, wow. So, we all go through these learning curves. And I guess sometimes things that might appear to be obvious to some people are not obvious. And so that's why actually getting out and talking to a lot of people and doing that market research is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, from an investor point of view, when you're going to go pitch to an investor and you show the investor that you really, really understand the market from a global perspective, you know who all the players are, you know who the VCs are, you can clearly articulate, all right, at stage 1, my company's going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is a segment that we're going to look for. These are the key milestones and the KPIs we're going to put in place. Then at stage 2, once we've actually hit that, those milestones, and you put a time frame on there, stage 2, we're going to do this. And whatever that might be, and have those KPIs in place as well. If you go and pitch that to an investor, I can guarantee you have people throwing money at you because you're going to have instill a level of confidence that you actually understand from a global perspective. But many times when I see sort of founders, they don't think like that because they get too caught up in the technology of their business rather than thinking about making it really, really simple in terms of what problem they're trying to solve. And I always sort of say to a lot of startups, your pitch deck, if a 12 or 13-year-old can't actually understand what you're actually on about, then you've got it wrong. And if you can't say it in 5 to 6 slides, you've got it wrong. It means that you have to go back and the hardest thing, Cullen, is to actually be simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I know something about that, but I won't go there now. Okay. Steamrolling ahead. Our startup Apt Possible has absolutely shot through the roof and they're doing incredibly well. The founder has decided they're going to incorporate, they're going to become a not-for-profit, they're going to be saving some part of the world. And assuming they've got all of the legal side set up, they're moving on to the point where they're setting up a board of directors and some advisors along with choosing a leader. What are some of the key key things to this setup, having a board of directors and having a CEO and moving into that level that you think are really important?
Well, I think I see this also when companies go through this stage. I think this, first of all, I think it's really going back to basics and understanding the skill set of everyone that you're going to bring on. What do you actually need? So forget about the people for the moment. What does a company actually need? What skills do you need in there to begin with? Okay. And I always sort of say, when you're putting together a board, you always go for a board that's actually quite a sort of a high level board, in the sense where they're going to push you. They're going to push the CEO, all right? Because that's the job of the board. The board is there to guide, to help, to push, to mentor. And if you're going to get a board that's at your level or just below, then once again, I think it's you're doing that wrong. It's the wrong way to do it, because you're not going to have that. You're not going to grow. So I think one of the key things is, when you're starting to put into the board, be very clear how many people you're going to have on the board. Number one, what's going to be the role of those members? What's going to be the governance structure? So if one of those members are not performing the way that they should be performing, then what's their exit, and how's that exit going to take place? If the CEO is also, and the founder is not, has reached their limit, which sometimes can happen, well, at what point do we actually get them to step aside and let someone else come in? Right. And I think it's always, this is all about putting the ego aside here. Right. And it's really thinking about, how are you going to really take this startup or this company that we've incorporated and really grow it into something. And it should become bigger than just one or two people or board, and I think people, you have to think like that, Cullen, when you're actually putting these things together. Now they're difficult. It's not easy. And it can get quite emotional, but I think it only becomes emotional when you don't actually have the right structure and people aren't clear. So once you have that really clear governance, and it's very, very documented and articulated, very, very clear, then there can never be any misunderstandings, because everyone's sort of going in there with their eyes wide open. I think these things tend to fall apart is when it's a group of friends that have come together, and they're pulling in their other friend into there, and what have you, and it's not clear. So I think that clarity has to be important, but also more importantly, having the right skills.
Yeah, brilliant. So just sort of wrapping up on the last question, I guess, around apt possible. They've got to this point. They've created the board. They've got this thing steamrolling along, and they've been doing a lot of business, a lot of trade with startups, and they decide that they're going to move into a more corporate kind of, dealing with corporates, more B2B and on other levels. What are some of the things that startups need to think of at that stage and other stages, when they begin to interact with corporates and they begin to change that business model where they're having a much deeper corporate interaction?
This is exactly what I've had to deal with on a daily basis.
Oh, really?
With Tomorrow Street. So one of the things is startups speak a different language, and so do corporates, right? And so from a corporate perspective, and I sort of touched on it earlier, we look at risk profile. We're always thinking about the startup, do they have enough capital? Where's it going to, if they start to grow and we start to use them, how are we going to develop them? Where's the intellectual property sitting? And how tight is that? So there's a lot of different things that we look at. From the startup's perspective, they come into us and all they want to do is they sort of see, oh, wow, this is a massive organization. And if I land this particular deal, it's going to be life-changing for me. So I'll do whatever it takes. And I'll adapt to whatever it takes. And a lot of the time, recently, and I can give you an example, I had recently we had an event where I invited about 10 startups into Luxembourg. And I pulled in our procurement team. And we had maybe about 100 odd people there from a procurement organization, just some of them there. And I said to the startups, you're going to pitch to these guys. And I said to the audience, I want you to actually give the startup some very constructive feedback in terms of their pitch deck and how they're actually going to pitch it. And it was really interesting. I had one gentleman get up and he did his pitch, and it was really interesting where he was sort of started pitching his company, and he basically started to talk about, I think he went into like 5 or 10 different ways that he could actually solve a problem and what services he was actually offering. So it was almost like a guy coming with a big suitcase, and sort of say, here we go. I've got all these different sort of things. Which one do you want? And I understood what he was trying to do, because he was in front of an audience. And what he was trying to unpack was, he was trying to sort of say, well, which one of these things that I've got in my company is really going to resonate with the audience? Which one is going to excite the audience? So he was really, I could see him really, really looking for body language and really trying to study the audience. And at the end of the pitch, someone from one of the procurement guys got up, and girls, and got up and said, I would never ever deal with you. And I sort of intervened at that point and said, well, why? Let's break it down and understand what you're uncomfortable at. And he goes, because he, the guy that's actually doing the pitch does not have any focus. He's actually coming in here and he's coming with 5 or 10 different ideas. And it shows to me that he's actually not being very, very focused. And so therefore, I'm getting very, very nervous, because I don't really know what I'm going to be buying. And I don't know what you're actually really good at.
Yeah.
And it was a really, it was a real eye-opener for the startup at the other end, because he was sort of trying to fish around to work out which was the best, which one was going to get the most traction for him. And so a lot of the time I see that where startups come in, and I always say, be very, very pointed and be very, very focused on what you're actually trying to do. Don't try to solve all the problems in one go, because you won't. And a corporate, you have to think also the timelines. You're not going to, when you're dealing with a smaller organization, you're working on very, very short sales cycles. When you hit a corporate, your sales cycles are going to blow out 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever it might be. And you have to think about, when you get to that stage, really be able to stomach that, because there'll be a lot of frustration. And I see a lot of frustration with the startups coming in there with the expectation, thinking, well, I've got a great product, I've got a great service, I'm already selling it out there. But why won't they take it on board? Why won't they just sign up now and buy it for 10 countries? It just doesn't work like that. So so it's really about thinking about that sort of that sales cycle and having the patience around that, and thinking about, when you deal with the corporate, there's a totally different set. Another thing that I sort of implemented in Vodafone was, with our procurement side, was the contracts that they're going to throw at you. And when I first started at Vodafone, some of the contracts that we had our suppliers sign was like 300 plus pages. So you've got a small startup coming in here to deal with us, maybe doing 1 or 2 or 3 million revenue, and we're throwing a 300-page legal document over. So it's rightly so, they got very scared. So one of the things that I looked at was saying, well, how do we actually now make this a little bit easier? So I managed to pull that 300 sort of page document down to 3 pages. And we sort of were able to stage it. And I sort of said, okay, at the 3 pages, we're just going to basically run a proof of concept. And we want to validate, we want to understand, you're telling me your product and service can do X, Y, Z, but I want to go out there and I want to see it for myself. And a lot of the time we would run this proof of concept, and and this will happen a lot with corporates when startups sort of move into that sort of realm, is that you'll run the proof of concept. And what we're really looking for is, we understand that there'll be gaps. We're okay with that. We just need to understand what they are, because the last thing that we want is to have surprises.
Yeah.
And so, if we know that there's a gap, which there always is, I can then pull in a resource from wherever I need it around the world to help that startup. And that's, and to sort of plug that gap and help them to develop. So that's, I think, very, very important.
Fantastic. I'm just I'm just thinking as we wrap up, really, much of that is to do with strategy, and much of that really is to perhaps even understand, look, we can get our cash flow from this part of the business, but in terms of this other part of the business, the corporate stuff, it's probably going to take much longer. And so therefore we need to anticipate that, build that into the strategy, build that into the forecast, and sort of have a different way of thinking about that entire vein. Yeah?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Because when they do get it with the corporate, they'll usually, it'll be worth it. But they have to be patient and really, and as I said earlier on, they have to have that level of maturity. Because that's what we look for.
Brilliant. Look, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to put some links in the show notes here so that people can see some of the work that you've been doing, some of the stuff that's gone on with Tomorrow Street as well. I know there's a great magazine as well as plenty of resources online as well in order to see some of the work that you've been doing there, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that'll be lovely. Thank you. And Cullen, I was going to say, if any of your listeners, I'm from Melbourne and I'm back in Melbourne here. And if any of your startups need a bit of advice, I'm more than happy to give my time for free and to help some of the startups out. So if there's anyone out there that would like to have a chat with me, I'm more than happy to do so.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Well, we'll make sure they can get in touch with you through the show notes. And thanks for joining us. I feel like this has been a long time coming. We've been talking for some time, and so really pleased that you've been able to make it onto the show, and it's been wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right, brilliant. Cheers. So thanks for joining us. Absolutely brilliant. I just wanted to share with you, everybody, this is my last show on Silicon Beach Radio. It's a very proud moment for me. It's been an amazingly wild ride the last couple of years. It's been a bit of a blast. We started out recording at the Bitcoin Centre, at the Blockcoin Centre in South Melbourne, and a lot of things have transposed since there. And so, look, I just want to say thank you for supporting us, for listening in, joining us and sharing our shows and our work. And the great news is that Dan is going to carry on the work here. Dan from Simpatico, a very good friend of mine, is taking over Silicon Beach Radio, and he's got some great shows, some great work. So I'm going to be joining in like you as a listener. And there's some other things happening. I've got a new position with Silicon Beach, which we might get to talking about perhaps at some stage, maybe with Dan later down the track. And so I just wanted to share with you, I'm really excited about the direction of Silicon Beach Radio, where it's heading now. And I feel so very, very grateful for you joining us. And a big thanks to my editing team in North America. I don't think I could have done this, and it's been amazing to have you alongside as we've managed to keep things moving. And so I just wanted to say to you, no matter what the challenges are that you're working on in your startup, on your entrepreneurial journey, please, by all means, it's onwards and upwards. And if you want to reach out and contact me for any reason, you can do that on my profile on meetup.com or through the Silicon Beach website at siliconbeachoz.net. So thank you very much. Cheers. From Silicon Beach Radio today. I'm glad it all wasn't.
This makes so much more sense now.
That's what we're speaking on.
Yeah.
Silicon Beach has radio?
Yeah.
Wait, you're recording.
This is pirate radio. Silicon Beach also has a business model and sponsorship.
I can't hear this bit.